Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Carneades.org. Hopefully, you can hear me. If someone can in the chat let me know that the sound is working, um, or see. Hopefully, you can see what's going on. We have some people watching. Hopefully, you should be seeing a video of me creating for the What is Socialism, the Bernie face, but we'll see if the technology is working for me. So thank you all for tuning in. It is greatly appreciated. Wonderful. All right. Many people say they can hear. Fantastic. So I see some questions coming in already. I'm going to say a couple things at the top and then dive into questions. So first off, as I've said on previous live streams, because of the work that I do internationally in places that are very opposed to atheists and atheism broadly, I don't generally talk about my personal life here or these kinds of things. But that said, I will answer the first question that came in from Gear. I am definitely fine. We're in a crazy world these days in terms of the pandemic and everything. I am fine, both personally in terms of my health and financially doing okay with all the economic costs. So that aside, don't worry about me. But we're not going to worry about personal questions right now. We're here to talk philosophy. So with that, we've already got some great questions coming in. So I'm going to go through and do my best to answer the questions in the chat as we go along. But then after the video, if there's any questions that I haven't gotten to, feel free to offer in the comments. And unlike other videos where I'm a little spotty with the comments, I will really try to answer every single question that I didn't get to in the chat in the comments. So first off, after the very kind question, I'm doing okay, thank you, is do I have a favorite philosopher? Ooh, that's a tough one. I have a lot of philosophers that I really like. Clearly, I am more geared towards skeptical philosophers. I love Socrates for a lot of reasons, both because he's such kind of an iconic character beyond just being a philosopher, of being someone that's kind of poking and prodding and being the Athenian gadfly and asking people questions to kind of try to draw out their own conclusions or their own contradictions that they have. So I love Socrates, but I also love Bertrand Russell for kind of his mix of doing a lot of work within the realm of logic, but also just such a wide-reaching amount of work in terms of making philosophy more accessible to a range of people, as well as just all the different things that he did in his life. So I think he's fascinating too. So a lot of people, those are two off the top of my head, but so many philosophers, so fantastic. What is Bernie doing here? He was the most recent face that I did. We're going to have a couple of kind of videos that play through as I'm chatting, but for the What is Socialism video, he was there. Next up, how do I refute Socrates' argument against democracy? I don't off the top of my head, I will admit, know exactly what Socrates' argument against democracy is. I know that broadly Plato thinks that we should have a republic. Plato has a lot of issues with his stuff. As I said, I love Socrates. I love a lot of Plato's earlier works where Socrates is more questioning. The Republic, I get a little iffy on. I think it's basically an issue that I want to bring up in a video someday, an issue of philosophers often try to construct their philosophy to explain the ability of someone to be a philosopher, and either that be acceptable morally or be the best position in society. So Plato effectively has philosopher kings, and so Plato's society basically is a way for him to explain how, well, really doing philosophy is the best thing that you should do. Now, don't get me wrong, I love philosophy, but I'm a little suspicious that the kind of judges of this of what you should be doing with your life are saying, you should be doing exactly what I'm doing right now. It makes me a little worried. So that aside, I don't have Socrates' argument off the top of my head, but feel free to offer it as a separate part of a question or a simple version, and I can give you my thoughts. All right. If skepticism ever does get solved, what do you expect the answer will look like? Oh, and happy early Star Wars Day. Well, thanks, Benton Anderson. If skepticism ever does get solved, what do I suspect the answer will look like? I think that's a fascinating question. I think that a lot of work should be done within the realm of exploring non-classical logical systems. I think there's a number of problems with classical logic that manifest themselves in the liar's paradox writ large and all the things I've done on that kind of stuff. And I think there may be a root. Non-classical logic is a very interesting realm of study, but it's also something that hasn't gotten as much study as I think it should. I think if there were more study done in something like that, we might arrive at a logical system that can deal with some of those logical contradictions that arise from a statement as simple as this statement is false. And that might help us move past and move on to being able to build in axioms that at the very least are non-contradictory. I don't know if we're ever going to get axioms that can kind of be foundationally proved in and of themselves, but I'm worried if our entire logical system is based on something that seems to have inherent contradictions in it. So thank you. What is my take on post-positivism? As in post-logical positivism is what I'm going to guess that is, but feel free to offer your thoughts below. So broadly, logical positivism is a group of people that have the wonderful idea that we can kind of prove everything, or that all of our statements can be empirically justifiable, and things that aren't empirically justifiable are meaningless or problematic. The inherent problem with that, as Quine famously points out in Two Dogmas of Empiricism, is that that statement itself can't really be empirically justified. And philosophy takes something of a linguistic turn. So I don't know exactly what you mean by post-positivism, but broadly, I think the linguistic turn in philosophy, where philosophers, particularly analytic philosophers, look more at kind of philosophy of language and have delved kind of into that, is interesting. I think that it's helpful in some ways. It points out some of the kind of issues broadly with the idea of positivism, that you can build everything up from kind of just empirical observations. But it also has made philosophy a little bit the study of what does this word really mean, which I think can be fun sometimes. I think it can also be challenging and make philosophy feel a little bit more divorced from real life. Thank you, King Matthew, the Destroyer of Worlds. I'm glad that I helped you make it through philosophy classes. What do I think about sweatshops? Fascinating question. It's a very broad concept to cover of what is a sweatshop even. But broadly, if we're thinking of what do I think about maybe labor regulations of should we, so you can have kind of an economic / philosophical argument of do we need minimum labor standards? Well, minimum labor standards are things that will be challenging for your strong capitalists to pay the workers, and it'll decrease efficiency. But it's also going to be a situation where, in theory, you're increasing the broad social good. So I think that a challenge of economics that philosophy can bring against it is the way that benefit is measured, particularly in terms of economic benefit. I think that when Mill and the like of other utilitarians that kind of form the foundation of economics thought about it, they weren't thinking that one individual, a capitalist or someone that owns kind of the structures, the capital, could get so much benefit from something that it would outweigh a lot of other people getting a cost or bearing a cost for that. So I think that the reason perhaps that sweatshops could be problematic from even a utilitarian standpoint or a kind of strong economic consequentialist standpoint is something around arguing that economists are bad at measuring value to individuals, and that value to society isn't something we really care about when we think that one person on one end of the income spectrum can get a huge amount. But I'm not sure. By the end of the stream, the image will be covered in full commie red. Yes, yes, Bernie in true socialist fashion is being done in red, though that's mostly just a practical thing of when I'm making the faces. It's easy for me to just make them black and then make a color that easily shows up on them. But yes, he's a good socialist and would be happy to be having his face made red. Is it too late to start studying philosophy at 18 with the goal of becoming a professional philosopher? Should I start with Plato, and what should I read in terms of philosophy books? It's definitely not too late. It's definitely never too late to start studying philosophy. And something I realized when I kind of started into philosophy and started studying it was a lot of the questions in philosophy were questions I had been thinking about my entire life. They were questions about knowledge. Can we really know anything? They're questions about what's right and wrong to do. If you've gotten to the point of being at 18 and haven't thought about kind of what's right and wrong, I'd be surprised. So you've been thinking about a lot of these philosophical questions. Philosophy is just a way to kind of think of it and frame it. Should you start with Plato, and how should you read philosophy books? That's a tough one. Plato is often dense and difficult to get through, and some of kind of the classics and these things can turn people away from philosophy. So it can be tough to start with Plato, dig into the Republic or something, and say, "Oh, I'm going to understand philosophy." I think sometimes it can be helpful for people starting out to start with secondary texts, so that's someone else explaining what's going on in a philosophy. And then once you have that kind of broad sense, then going back and read the primary text and start understanding kind of what's going on with it. There's a lot of secondary texts out there. As I mentioned earlier, Bertrand Russell does a great job of creating kind of gradated texts. Some of them are very complex and complicated. Some of them are great for kind of an intro to philosophy. And he's a great philosopher in and of himself, so he can kind of make that accessibility while still having a bit of the rigor. But there's also kind of a lot of, I don't know, fun. There's comedy books. I feel Plato and a Platypus Walk into Heaven or something like that is a book that's out there. But there's kind of those books that make it easier and more accessible. If you're going into a course in a college or a university, then you have the opportunity to dive into those classics because you have a little bit more of that guidance. So I'd say start reading Plato, particularly some of, like I said, the shorter ones, a Euthyphro or something like that. And if you love it, great, keep going. If it feels too dense, that's not all that philosophy is, and feel free to go into that more. Moving on, favorite analytic philosopher. Oh my. All right. And why? Oh, favorite analytical philosopher. So like I said, for more recent philosophers, I love Bertrand Russell. I think so I don't just talk about Russell. Favorite living philosopher, I think Kripke is fascinating. I think Kripke's story is amazing of kind of some of the things that he did early in his life. And his work on modal logic is very, very interesting and very revolutionary. So I have a bit of a bias being someone that really loves the logic side of philosophy and those things. I, of course, love Russell with his books on logic, Principia Mathematica, and these things, but also Kripke with his works on modal logic and things like that. So I do like them, but I love Russell because he has that kind of broad expanse of, he's not just doing revolutionary things in logic, he has opinions on everything, and he lived so long he was able to express his philosophy on a lot of things. Good. I'm glad you appreciate my answer. Is there a philosopher that I disagree with or that I dislike? I would say, importantly in philosophy, those are very different questions. A philosopher that I inevitably end up disagreeing with is William James. I don't know why, but whenever I find an argument, I'm always on the opposite side of William James on that argument. Maybe not always, but I deeply disagree with him. And maybe it's just a deep skeptical dislike of his pragmatism in these things. But that's not to say that I dislike William James or think that he's a bad person. I just deeply disagree with a lot of his philosophers. Philosophers that I dislike, I think I get frustrated by some, not all, some kind of apologists that are disingenuous. So I'll take a comparison. Alvin Plantinga, I think, is a great philosopher who argues kind of the apologist, theist position that's out there. And I think he does a great job of it. And while I disagree with him, does justice to a number of the arguments. I think you can get deep into that place where people are what Socrates might call more kind of sophists, where people are just trying not to pursue truth, but trying to argue with you to make you feel bad or use a lot of logical fallacies to do that. So those people that often call themselves philosophers, I dislike and get frustrated with. What do I think about the Kyoto School? I will fully, as a skeptic, I don't know anything, and I don't know enough about the Kyoto School to comment, though it's something I'd love to look into more. I'd say non-Western philosophy is something that Kyoto, assumedly, is perhaps a Japanese school, but I may be wrong, is something I'd love to delve into more, but it's not as much my background. What do I think is the blueprint for optimal politics? I could do an entire dissertation on that. I think it's a challenge. I think ethically there are good cases made for some way in which people choose leaders. The governments have power by the consent of the governed. I think Locke has a convincing argument around that I would rather have a leader that is given power by the consent of the governed, so something that looks like democracy, than a leader that is there by divine right or these kinds of things. That said, I think democracies run into a number of problems. You have the need for kind of a constitutional democracy that protects the rights of the minority against oppression of the majority, while you also have the problems of insufficiently informed populace. You run into all sorts of issues of who are they really voting for? Are they voting based on their feeling or their gut, or based on real public disagreement, or these kinds of things around actual policy? So I have no idea is the simple answer, which is the easy answer because I'm a skeptic, what the blueprint for an optimal politics is. I think that I can say that certain types of politics or certain political systems, I might say probably are worse than others, and I can probably poke holes in a number of political systems. I don't know what a good political system is, or even if one exists, or even if there is a possible way for us to optimally get through a political system and have everyone be happy. If anything, I'm skeptical that one exists at all. Yes, Bertrand Russell, I'm a big fan. Interested in political and economic philosophy. What should I start reading? Prince by Machiavelli. Jonathan Rawls is something that a lot of people talk about these days. So I would recommend that. Some of it depends on kind of where your leanings are. Clearly, as evidenced by the video that's going on now, and the popularity of my video on socialism, Marx has had a huge impact on a lot of what some people might call philosophy, some might call politics, or just kind of ideology. But that is something that's interesting to read. There's a lot of, I would encourage you, if you are interested in kind of economic philosophy, to get both the background in philosophy, particularly the works of Mill and other kind of utilitarianisms, as well as the economic background to understand what economists are talking about, which is just taking an economics 101 class or reading kind of some of that basic stuff, supply, demand, all of these things. Adam Smith, of course, all that kind of stuff. So that's some of the places I might start. In terms of political, Locke, Hobbes, those are some of the places to start with that. But yeah, a lot more of my background is in kind of the logic, the epistemology side of things than the political and economic philosophy, though, as y'all have seen with the videos we've been doing, I've been getting more into that. Greetings to you as well, Yang Wenli. In previous Q&As, I've sometimes used the adjective pop to describe certain thinkers, such as Sam Harris. Curious as to why you've added the adjective pop to them, because it implies unphilosophical thinking, or more specifically, what would you distinguish a person being a philosopher as opposed to another person, even if they present the same fundamental idea? Good question. So, taking a step back, I am not of the opinion that being particularly popular or well known is necessarily a bad thing for someone that is in philosophy. I think it can be often quite beneficial in that it helps you get your ideas out. I think that there is. Let me see if I can phrase this well. I think that sometimes philosophers are. I think there's a line to be drawn between sophists and philosophers, and I think this is one of the reasons that I love Socrates. I think there's a line to be drawn between people that will do whatever they can to convince you of a point, even if it means kind of using logical fallacies and that. And I'm not saying that Sam Harris fits into this, but I do think that there are those both on either side of kind of the spectrum of the theist atheist arguments that will do these things that I get frustrated at watching, that feel like it's an ad hominem attack, or it's not a good, strong, kind of rigorous logical argument. It's you're attacking their character, you're attacking something that is going to distract people from the actual argument, and that makes me frustrated. And so those people I feel fit more into the pop. I think Sam Harris has some actual real philosophical arguments. And so I don't mean to make that kind of diminutively, but I would say that be careful of there are a lot of people out there who present arguments that are bad arguments because they have a goal in mind, and they may present a bad argument just because it's a bad argument, or it may be kind of a disingenuous one. So I would watch out for that. Like I said, I don't know necessarily if don't know if everything that Sam Harris says fits into that, but I think a lot of people that kind of write those kinds of books, sometimes they can just be making philosophy more accessible. Sometimes they can kind of be trying to point you in a very specific direction, perhaps by making poor arguments. Please suggest to me introductory books for modal logic and how to proceed. Yikes. It is challenging to get good books on things like modal logic and some of the higher order logics. There are very few resources out there. It's one of the reasons that I like creating my series on kind of the 3 months of modal logics. A great place to start is places like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. If you go to their entries on particular modal logic, so if you're looking at deontic logic or temporal logic, their deontic logic section is very exhaustive. And even if that's not exactly what you're looking for, they will have great citations that you can look at and get a sense of what books they're drawing from. So that would be the direction I would point you. Good. We're back to Socrates' argument on democracy. But I just lost my spot. Goodness. Thank you for all of your questions and everything that's coming in. Basically, if you were with 100 people on a ship, you would choose the most experienced ones to control it. Right. So this is a little bit what I was saying of Plato being like, oh, you would pick the philosophers, the philosopher kings. I think it's, if anything, it's a case towards something more of a representative democracy, though clearly that has its own set of problems than a direct democracy. You could say, yes, you would pick the most experienced ones to control it, but who would pick them is perhaps the challenge. Should you have everyone vote to pick them, or should you pick them by who has the most money, who descended from the previous steerer of the ship, these kinds of things. I also think that a case against Socrates and Plato here is something along the lines of, this is a poor metaphor of steering a ship is not necessarily something that is similar to governing. Governing is not a technical thing, but particularly with leaders, you're looking for people that can pick good people to work with them that have those good technical skills or who share your values or your ideals. Whereas steering a ship, you just need someone to be actually physically good at steering a ship, not someone to pick the person that's going to be good at steering a ship. So that might be a way to get some of that nuance in there. But if anything, it feels to me like that argument points towards just representative democracy over direct democracy, which I think you can make a case for. What is my opinion of Thomas Paine? A challenging question. I don't know enough about Thomas Paine. This is always the tough thing because when I make videos, I can do all the research ahead of time, but when I just get thrown out a particular figure in history, I don't have enough sense of any of his kind of philosophy and his philosophical arguments to give you a sense of my opinion of him. But if you in the comments offer me a good argument from him or an idea, I can give you my first take on it. Speaking of intense questions, why are materialism, idealism, and neutral monism considered to be attributive monism and not substance monism, while they clearly state that there is only one fundamental substance? Interesting. I don't know who is making that claim that they're considered to be attributive monism and not substance monism. It could be me in my series, in my video on monism. I would have to re-dig back into the differences between neutral versus attributive monism to give you a better answer, and I don't want to tell you something that's incorrect right now. But feel free to throw that question to me, as well as the question on Thomas Paine or any of these others that I'm kind of bunting on, in the comments below this video, and I will answer all the comments, unlike some of the other videos. So feel free to throw that out. Great. Hello, new to philosophy. Where do you start in philosophy, and what should you read? All the works of major philosophers. So, like I said a little bit earlier to a similar question, I would say start with things that you're interested in. So I would think philosophy is huge. Philosophy deals with politics and economics and value, but it also deals with knowledge and information. It deals with logic and arguments and things that verge on math. It deals with ethics, what's right and wrong. It deals with metaphysics, things that exist. It deals with so many different things. So I would say, what of all of those things feels like the most interesting to you? The Map of Philosophy video, if you haven't seen it, has a lot of that kind of stuff. Check it out to get a sense of what is the universe of philosophy. What are all the different things? And then once you have a sense of what you're interested in, then you can kind of start with a thread of, okay, I'm interested in logic, so I want to read these particular philosophers, or I'm interested in ethics, so I want to read these particular philosophers, or these particular works of an individual philosopher. So that would be where I would say to start. If you start reading, I don't know, Descartes, and you get like, oh, this is really dense, this is hard to get through, I don't quite understand what he's talking about here. As I encouraged before, secondary sources are not a bad thing. Feel free to start in kind of a secondary source, someone that's talking about what that philosopher said, to get your feet wet a little bit, and then dig into the primary source later, is what I would say. So I would say first, figure out what area of philosophy you're interested in. If you're interested in all of them, that's great. And then based on that, pick some of the philosophers that might fit that well. Is there a field such as metaethics that deals with meta-normativity? What is normativity? Do normative systems have truth value? And can any normative system determine what ought to be? I don't know if I understand perfectly what you're talking about, but let me give it my best shot. So broadly, ethics deals with what is right and wrong. Metaethics deals with kind of what kinds of things are right and wrong. Are they the kinds of things that are objectively completely true? Are they the kinds of things that we have constructed out of societal values? These kinds of things. Philosophers usually use the word normative to refer to ethics. So I don't quite know the distinction that you're making here between kind of ethics and normativity. But it sounds like metaethics may be kind of what you're looking for. Whether or not those normative systems or cultural norms have any truth value is going to be something that metaethics is going to talk about. It just may be a certain part of metaethics that deals with cultural relativism is often used as a pejorative term, but those systems that are just looking at kind of what everyone thinks and whether that can have truth value. So if that's what you're talking about, kind of coherentist systems of truth might be something to look into. or some of those, I would say, non-cognitivist ethics that fit into that meta-ethical category might be interested in. Oh, once again, going to throw out a word that I do not know off the top of my head. What do I think about accelerationism? I think I should research it and do a video on it because it sounds fascinating, but I have no idea. An easier question to answer. How about that? How do you decide what main branch of philosophy is the right one for you? This is great. So we can split philosophy in a couple different ways. We can split philosophy broadly in terms of thinking about what you're talking about or what you're researching. So this is something like the difference between metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Or you can think about it in how you're researching and how you're digging into it, such as kind of the difference between an analytic philosopher, a continental philosopher, an Eastern philosopher, and these kinds of things. So depending on what you mean by branches, this could have a couple different answers. But if you're talking about kind of the big content branches of ethics versus epistemology versus metaphysics, I'd say try some things. If you're the kind of person that likes to dig into time travel paradoxes and what things really are, then metaphysics fits you better. If you're the kind of person that wants to push on someone and say, but how do you know that? Epistemology fits you better. If you care about what's right and wrong, many of us probably do, but if that's something that you want to study, the broad sphere of ethics and kind of political philosophy fits that better. In terms of kind of the analytic versus continental versus Eastern, that at the end of the day, people are often educated in one of those traditions and kind of follow that along. And so it's probably more just coming from a place of personal bias than anything, not from a place of like, this is what we think is the right thing to do. Or this is a good match for an individual or someone else. I would say start reading something, see if you like it, or start communicating with people in a particular kind of group of philosophers. See if their kind of philosophy is something you get along with. And if it's not, then try something else. That would be broadly my pitch. But also kind of look into those, if you're thinking of content-wise, look into those big branches, see what feels right, and remember that metaphysics is a giant kind of topic. So even if one particular kind of metaphysics doesn't appeal to you, another one probably will. What are my thoughts on Berkeley? I would say, so Berkeley, and watch me do myself shame if I am not aware of this, but Berkeley's an idealist. He's a philosopher who basically, idealism is saying that everything's kind of thought. Yeah, George Berkeley. Okay, I'm just making sure I'm not giving you bad information. Yeah, so he's defending the idea of idealism, that everything is thought, that we don't have this nice substance. So compared with Descartes' dualism of you have both kind of mind and substance out there. So I would comment broadly. I think idealism, as a skeptic, I think idealism picks up a thread of there is a problem out there that we're really bad at knowing things, and we can't really interact with what we assume is the world around us. I think it then draws some troubling conclusions about therefore everything is a dream in the mind of God, or therefore everything's just in our heads. And I think if we can't know anything about the external objects that we're interacting with, there's no way we can know that this is a dream in the mind of God as opposed to a simulation in the Matrix, as opposed to an evil deceiver, as opposed to these kinds of things. So as a skeptic, I'm with the first concern of you're not really interacting with physical objects, you're not really doing all these things, so you might just be in kind of this mind world, but I don't know that we know that, and I don't think you can either. So that broadly is my thought on that. Can I do more videos about the analytic-continental divide? Interesting, and classify their methodologies. You're doing a graduating project about it. Cool. So the analytic continental divide, as you're likely aware, am coming very much from kind of the analytic side of that divide. And so always struggle when covering it because I feel I don't do the continental side justice. I simply have my own analytic bias towards it. I can try doing more videos on it. Broadly, if you're of the opinion of, Carneades, I want you to do a video on this. If you go to Patreon, and I'm actually trying to keep up with Patreon, much better, and pledge $10 a month, and then send me an email and say, I want a video on this, I'll go make that video. So if it's a philosophical topic, if it's, I want a video on what you're having for lunch today, I'm probably not going to make the video. But, so if you really want something on that, I'd encourage you to donate on Patreon. I would love to dig more into the analytic continental divide, but from my side, it will take me researching continental philosophy more to get a sense. Ooh, are you a moral realist? If so, why? And if not, why not? So I'm a skeptic, which means that I get to kind of bunt on basically any question of what I am other than that because I'm a skeptic. So I don't know that there is real good and evil out there, that there's a real kind of, this is right, that's wrong. Because I don't know anything. So that's the easy answer. I think that it is, the challenge for all of us is that regardless of what we think about what is right and wrong, we are faced with moral questions every day. And so I think a more interesting question is not necessarily what do you believe about morality, but how do you act when faced with moral dilemmas? Because I can say that I believe whatever you want, but if I'm what most people would consider a bad person when it comes down to it, what I believe doesn't really matter. So that to me is a more interesting question. How do you act when faced with a moral dilemma, and how do you make those choices? Whether or not there's a moral reality out there, I have no idea, and I don't know if we could ever know. But I do think it's interesting to find out how people would act. I will say, in my own actions, I lean towards acting in a more utilitarian way than a deontological or virtue ethics way. But it depends on the situation. Watch me be a particularist here. All right. So considering a physics and philosophy major, any thoughts? Great. Wonderful. I think there's a lot of crossover between physics and philosophy. I think that within the world of philosophy of science, you can get kind of some of those things that are on the edge, and particularly with something like physics, where at least some parts of physics are moving past what we might call something that's kind of verifiable or falsifiable. So I think there's some really interesting conversations there. I think the world of physics is better informed by people that have studied philosophy of science and understand kind of both the virtues of science as well as some of its limitations. And philosophy is certainly better informed by people that have studied physics. You can also take those in different directions and have your philosophy be completely about ethics and your physics have nothing to do with it. But I think that both of those fields are well informed by the other. What do I think about deliberative democracy, justificationary liberalism, and public reason deliberations, as well as epistemological anarchism? Fascinating. Some of these things I have a little bit of a background in, some of them I don't have as much of a background in. So my series on the Wahale method of development talks a little bit about some of my thoughts on deliberative democracy. I think that both there is a problem with someone that just says, we need more democracy to fix a problem, because it seems to me that things like education are also important kind of pre-existing conditions to have some of those discussions. So things like that. Justificationary liberalism, I would love to have a definition of that term. And public reason deliberations, I don't know exactly what that means, but I can hazard a guess of broadly, should we have people debating in public to come to conclusions, and should kind of reason be guiding us through our deliberations through public debate. I think there's a case for them. I think that so much of it depends on the forum that you're doing it in. I think it can easily devolve into something that is not based in reason, but something that's not based in logic. Epistemological anarchism is a fascinating term that I would love to learn more about, but don't know off the top of my head. So feel free to give me more information about that in another comment. The notion of vicious circularity in epistemology. This is a great idea. I think it is extremely problematic for many kind of epistemist videos, what I would call epistemists, basically anyone that's not a skeptic, is the idea that you end up in this viciously circular thing of the only reason you can justify your premise is because that premise itself says that it can be justified effectively. You have this vicious circularity. I am concerned about it. I'm concerned that a lot of epistemology, if not all epistemology, rests on some kind of vicious circularity, and everyone is making some level of assumptions. As a skeptic, I draw the conclusion that until you show me something that's not viciously circular, I'm worried about believing anything. We have, to be more specific, do you believe that no indefensible notion of epistemic grounding exists such that it can't be meaningfully challenged from a skeptical standpoint? Or there's something such as, this goes on for a while. Knowledge is alternative notion, decaying either axiomatic suppositions or infinite regress. What do you think about the notion of grounding our educated collective home beliefs about the world? Pragmatic justification rise on the assumption of connection between knowledge and such environment. So, that's a lot of pieces. So broadly, I covered just the vicious circularity piece of it, but broadly what I'd say is I am worried that any level of epistemology will devolve into circularity or an infinite regress, or not be able to be grounded in some way, or have a raft problem, or what have you. However, and this is an important distinction, I'm a Pyrrhonian skeptic, not an academic one, meaning that I'm not convinced that we just haven't done enough philosophy to figure out what the right way to do epistemology is. I'm not convinced that this means that we can never know anything. I am just worried that none of the ways that we claim to know things so far have worked. So it's less the question of, I'm not fully on board with the yes, we can never know anything, we're never going to be able to know anything, sit and dwell in your pessimism or lack of knowledge, but rather the question of, I don't know, I haven't seen a convincing argument yet, but if you have a convincing one, feel free to offer it. Thank you, the JD Alistair, for taking the time to tell me thanks for the videos. Thank you all for watching and subscribing. We're here because we got up to 60,000 subscribers, which is insane to me, that there are 60,000 people out there that wanted to click subscribe. So thank you all for that. Raphael Bennis has a great question, which is, why am I here? As a skeptic, I have a great answer for any of these questions, which is, I don't know. But broadly, I think sometimes people come into philosophy with questions like this, like, why am I here? Is there a purpose to life? Which is a question that a lot of people want answered. And I wouldn't say not many people have answers to it, because I think people have plenty of answers to it. I don't know if they're the right answers is the challenge. So the question for you is, are you looking for someone to give you any answer? Someone can give you an answer. You're here to serve my will and to work in these minds that I have. Or you're here to follow this book that I have. Or you're here to be a philosopher and pursue knowledge, with our earlier conversation of philosophers frustratingly always seeming to carve out a space for philosophy being the right thing that everyone should always do. So I think there's a lot of answers to that question. I'm unconvinced by all of them. At least all of the ones I've seen so far. Great. All right. I have an impression that philosophy in general is a model for any intellectual system like sciences, mathematical systems, etc. Is my impression true? So I would say that what philosophy has going for it is that it was where a lot of those systems started. So as I mentioned at the beginning of kind of my map of philosophy video, there's a reason everyone still gets a PhD, a doctorate in philosophy of mathematics, of science, of these things. It's because everything used to be thought of as philosophy. Philosophy came up with kind of education and academics, hence the academy and all such things, were come up with by philosophers. And so that was just a house for all of kind of the knowledge and information. And then as time went on, we split those things out into separate sciences or disciplines and all of these things. And so philosophy in many ways is something of the model for that. And when you look back through the history of science, the scientific method is something that can be pulled out of some of the works of Descartes. And you say that these ideas of kind of building a particular methodology that can go off and then be its own discipline, that was pulled out of philosophy initially. So I would say, one, philosophy is often kind of the base or where some of these systems started, but two, philosophy has the advantage of still being a language that these systems can talk to each other with. Science has a methodology, which within the world of science, that methodology is kind of taken as sacrosanct, but philosophy of science says what is justifying that methodology, and then how can we compare the results of that methodology to some other system that is also, if not an offspring of philosophy, at least speaking the same language as it. So that would be what I would say about kind of that question, but I don't know if that's exactly what you're looking for. Oh my. All right, so many questions. All right. What are my thoughts on Zizek? I don't know. I have not studied Zizek much. I know he is a very modern philosopher, and a lot of people talk, oh, tell me what you think about Zizek. So I would say I haven't studied Zizek enough to have a comprehensive or a solid thought on him, and I don't want to kind of say something based on the little information I have about him and then be either blown out of the water by someone that knows more or just be saying something that's completely right. Let me blow your mind. The other day I realized Marxism is more a form of art rather than politics or philosophy. I think a valid critique of Marx is often that he's not really doing philosophy. He's more kind of explaining what he believed would happen, and he did a good job of predicting in some ways what would happen with kind of the industrial revolutions and these kinds of things. It's not necessarily a philosophy or a politics. So that point is taken a bit. That said, I do think that there are philosophical nuggets of what should or should not be that can be pulled out of Marx. And there are opinions about politics that can be pulled out. But I agree that his works live somewhere in the liminal space between politics, philosophy, art, history, criticism in general. So yeah, it's very interesting to read, very clearly influential, but perfectly a fit for philosophy. I don't know. Hey Carneades, my videos have been incredibly helpful with the degree at Warwick. Thanks so much and keep creating. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for watching, and thanks to everyone for being here and asking lots of questions. Thanks to all the subscribers and patrons out there that can keep us going. Thanks for the congratulations. What do I think about paraconsistent logic? Ooh, good question. Also, what are your thoughts on logical nihilism, and is that even a thing? So, as I said a little bit earlier, I think that there's a lot more study to be done on kind of non-classical logics that fit into the vein of not agreeing with kind of our classical axioms of what logic is. I think that not enough work has been done figuring out the consequences of those logics and of those ideas for us to have a good sense of whether or not they imply really problematic contradictions or whether or not they're broadly fine and they might be a better version of classical logic. I think we should do more work in that, and I think philosophers have the problem of kind of what economists might call a path dependency on the classical logic that we have, and so we're stuck with that, even though it has a lot of problems. What are my thoughts on logical nihilism? I don't know if that's a thing. It might be construed as the belief that all logical systems are broken. Once again, as a more Pyrrhonian than academic philosopher, I wouldn't be convinced that all logical systems are broken, but I'm equally not convinced that we have a perfect logical system yet. So, can we ever prove a theory of truth, or are we left to believe them by faith in order to begin even talking about philosophy? I don't know if this is a problem in epistemology already. So I think that it is certainly a problem. As a skeptic, I think it's a big problem. I think that it's problematic that we can't kind of prove whatever we want to believe from the ground up without taking some kind of axiom on faith. I don't think, though, and I'm not convinced that that means we can't even start talking about philosophy. So my kind of skepticism, I call it indirect skepticism, is based on kind of indirect proofs or proofs by contradiction, which is the idea that I don't need to believe anything to talk about what you think. So I think as a philosopher, I can go and talk about what other people think, show that they lead to a contradiction, and still have the conversation about philosophy, but not necessarily be saying I have a solid theory of truth that I can build stone by stone my entire philosophy on top of. That said, if you're in the place where you want to build a philosophy from the ground up, you're going to need something that looks like an epistemology or theory of truth to build it on top of. There are lots of people that'll offer them. As a skeptic, I'm worried. When did I realize I was an indirect skeptic? That's a great question. I think it was when I read arguments that showed that even the cogito could be doubted. I think that if you want to dig into skepticism and epistemology, read Descartes, a famous anti-skeptic, because he does a good job of making some of those kind of skeptical arguments himself, because he's trying to provide the best that a skeptic could be. And so when I read that and read the cogito, I was like, wow, there's all sorts of problems with Descartes after he gets to the cogito, and his clear ideas and his eventual proof of God, I think, are really problematic. But the basic idea of I think, therefore I am is really powerful. And I think reading arguments against that show ways that we can doubt even that were some of the things that made me think, wow, if we can doubt that, we can doubt anything. Or if we haven't gotten to the point of proving that yet, we haven't gotten to the point of proving anything. So partially that, and then kind of partially digging into more books on skepticism and ancient skepticism and getting a sense of some of those arguments around that led me to the lack of belief in anything. Okay, do I think esoteric political ideas, such as anarcho-primitivism, are as worthy of being researched and developed as more mainstream political thought? That's there's so many things wrapped up in that question, because it's a question of value, really. It's a question of what has worth or what has value to be researched. I think that we should try to find knowledge any way we can. I don't think we've gotten it, but I think we should try to find knowledge and information any way we can, especially because we haven't gotten there yet. And so I am worried to say that one particular thing, just because it's not popular, is not worthy of research, because it might turn out to be the thing that gets us some real solid good knowledge. That said, as kind of with the questions on moral realism, individuals who are decision makers within organizations that decide what's going to be funded and what's going to be researched have the challenging question of saying, we have limited resources, what can we fund of these choices? I think there's a case to be made both for funding a variety of research as well as funding a depth of research on particular topics. So I think with infinite resources, I think there's a case to be made for it. With limited resources, I don't know. I think it's a challenging, and you'd have to give me the other options of what else what in terms of mainstream political thought are you researching? One book suggestion. There's so many great books out there. It depends on what you want, so I'll give you a lot. I'll pitch a series that we're doing soon. So we're doing a series that's going to be coming up that y'all now have inside information on, that you'll see a few images from in a second, on Aristotle's Poetics. Aristotle's Poetics is a fascinating book. It's basically Aristotle's lecture notes on his opinions about ancient Greek philosophy, which, for better or worse, became extremely influential for the world of theater and the world of film later, for the rest of eternity, such that some of the things that we talk about in terms of the way to do comedy and tragedy are still dealing with the ideas presented in Aristotle's Poetics. It's a very short book, very quick ideas. It's so a fascinating read if you want to see kind of both what Aristotle thought about the Poetics and what makes good theater and what makes good storytelling, and also see and think about how that, because it did inform so much of the way that we tell stories for so many years in the future. So for a short, quick book that I'm thinking about right now, because we're just finishing up a series on it, that's the one that comes to mind. But there's so many books out there. Thank you as well. What do I think analytic philosophers should learn from continental philosophers? How about the other way around? As I said earlier with this, it's so... it's hard for me to give an unbiased view of this because I am so deeply steeped in the analytic tradition. I think that both of them can learn from each other, that the other position isn't completely worthless. I think that analytic philosophers can pick up from continental philosophers a lot more of things that people actually care about. I think that analytic philosophy often becomes so wrapped up in things like the linguistic turn and some of the things we've talked about here that they are dealing with things that are 3 times divorced from what we actually care about. And the analytic philosopher knows that this really esoteric conversation has some important implication on what we care about, but is so many times divorced from it that no one cares about it. Whereas I think the continental philosophers do a much better job of picking up on the things that actually matter to people. I think the other way around, if I can expose all my biases, is I often get frustrated with continental philosophy, whether it's for the non-specificity of it or the kind of lack of clarity, though a range of analytical philosophers have these problems as well. But I think the often literary nature of some continental philosophy makes it more challenging to suss out particular points. But once again, very, very biased towards analytic philosophy, want to learn more about continental philosophy, but don't have as much information on them to give an unbiased opinion. Awesome. I'm glad that I could answer your question. Is it justifiable to address philosophical questions today without studying non-Western traditions, such as classic Chinese ethics or Indian metaphysics? I think a fascinating question. I think that one thing that philosophy tries to do is it tries to answer questions without anything else going on. So it tries to say, I'm going to make an argument for you that can be convincing to you, even if you don't know anything about the history of where this argument came from. And so I think in that vein, it is completely justifiable to address philosophical questions. If you have a convincing argument, whether your argument is based on Chinese ethics, Indian metaphysics, or Western epistemology, if your argument is convincing, logically sound, and valid, and all of those things, I think you can make that argument even if you don't have reference or understanding to those places. That said, I think that there are also a lot that can inform one tradition from the other. I think that we can be informed about our ideas about ethics because an argument may have already been had or may have already been objected to in another way. I think it's tough with philosophy because philosophy is often kind of conversational in some ways. It's a back and forth between someone that's arguing with the person that wrote before them, that's arguing with the person that wrote before them, and going all the way back until you get to Plato or Thales or whoever. And so different traditions and different strains are often talking past each other, and so that can be challenging. But I do think that there is a lot to be gained from working with those different areas. I wouldn't say that you need to have a global sense of what everyone in philosophy has said to answer a specific question, though. So that would be my thoughts. Just wanted to thank you for the awesome content. Thank you as well. And once again, thanks to everyone watching, subscribing, and donating. So thanks very much. If you want to study rigorous modern logic, should you go study higher mathematics or just philosophy, or it doesn't matter? Great question. Logic sits very much at the kind of intersection in many ways of math and philosophy. There are some parts of math that use a lot of logic, and there's some parts of philosophy that use a lot of logic, and there's some parts of each that use absolutely none of each. I think it depends on what type of logic you care about. So if you care about something like modal logic, particularly like deontic logic, epistemic logic, doxastic logic, temporal logic can verge into computer science. But those kinds of things, they fit solidly within the realm of philosophy. We're talking about possible worlds. We're talking about kind of all these big ideas that don't always fit perfectly within mathematics. If, on the other hand, you're more interested in what I might consider higher order logics, things that correspond to something like set theory, or kind of the talking about groups of things, while philosophy will cover that a little bit, mathematics may be a better way to go. So the answer is, which may not be fulfilling, and I apologize, is that it depends on exactly what you're doing. Logic is in some ways split between philosophy and math, and both of them will give a good coverage of many parts of logic, but some fit solidly in one kind of discipline or the other. Back to normativity. Normativity refers to systems that are supposed to determine right and wrong, deontology, utilitarian, etc. And ethics refers to the systems created by what those systems tell you. Interesting. So the systems supposed to determine right and wrong are broadly what philosophers would refer to as ethics. And meta-ethics is the systems that inform whether right and wrong even exist. Then the systems that are created by what those systems tell you, so you have something that says right and wrong, I would call that applied epistemology, or not applied epistemology, applied ethics. So if you had a hierarchy, it would be kind of meta-ethics at the top, what even is right and wrong. Normative ethics are just ethics in the middle that says, okay, now that we know what types of thing right and wrong are, let's come up with a theory for these kinds of things are right, these kinds of things are wrong. And then applied ethics says, okay, now that we have this broad theory of what kinds of things are right and what kinds of things are wrong, how do we apply that to you're in this situation? How do you deal with it? Am I aware of any analytic philosophers doing some work on the relation between texts, textuality, and non-classical logic? Not off the top of my head is the answer, but I would be surprised if there weren't some out there. I would, if you're looking for some, as I often say, would start, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is updated quite regularly and tries to stay as current as they can with a lot of those things. So I would start your search there. All right, what do I think of normative web? I don't know what that is. So yeah, normative web. Like a coherentism of ethics, maybe? I'm not sure. Another thing, is there a more concrete way to exemplify Schrodinger's logic? What would I say are its applications? By Schrodinger's logic are... sorry, my brain's trying to wrap its head around my brain's head around the question. Are you saying kind of a tripartite logic of the cat is dead, alive, somewhere in the middle? There's a lot of non-classical logics that do deal with that and try to bring in a third option. Not all of them are kind of the superposition between dead and alive, but that that does exist in some, but like I said, non-classical logic is understudied. That said, if there's anything that is studied, it is kind of the quantum implications and those things. So it would be out there. All right, we are running out of time, unfortunately. But as I said at the top of the video, feel free to leave any things that I have not responded to as comments in this video after, and I will reply to them there. Unlike other videos where I go back and forth on comments and occasionally reply to some because there's just so many, I will reply to all the comments here at least once. All right, so I'm gonna speed up a little bit because I know we're running out of time. Am I a property dualist? No, because I'm a skeptic. Is the easy answer. I think that dualism has a high bar that it needs to prove not only for me as a skeptic that any substance exists or any properties exist, but that multiple do, and they are importantly different, and it gets a little mushy and concerning for me. That's not to say it's not true. It's to say that I need a strong argument for it. Should mathematics remain based on axiomatic set theory, or should we consider other principles to be the foundation of mathematics? I think that's a great question. I think that, as I've said, we've been talking a lot about the basics of logic and non-classical logic here, but one of the challenging things is with axiomatic set theories, with anything based on classical logic, is it's going to have all the problems that classical logic brings with it. I think that axiomatic set theory as a broad idea can be the basis for mathematics. I think that some of the challenges with it are that it is inherently based on classical logic. I think that there may be a non-classical logic that might be a better basis for axiomatic set theory that would then better set up mathematics, but I'm not sure. And I also am not well versed in all the alternatives to kind of axiomatic set theory. Can I do a video on the philosophy of time travel? I would love to. I think I have, I suppose I don't really have ones on time travel. I have some on the unreality of time. But yeah, definitely, if you want it sooner rather than later, hit me up with a $10 a month donation on Patreon. If you're willing to wait, it's definitely something that's on my list. What do I think about Unger's nihilistic account of vagueness? Is it any better than a supervaluationist account? Oh, Unger's a great philosopher, but I do not know his specific nihilistic account of vagueness, and have not studied vagueness recently enough to have a good, useful comment on that. All right, well, I know there's many more comments, and I feel bad that I haven't gotten to them, but thank you so much. Feel free, like I said at the top of the video, and a couple times throughout, if you have more questions, or if I didn't answer your question or I kind of bunted on it because I was like, I don't have an opinion right now, or ooh, you're catching me offhand, please write it as a comment. I am going to respond to all the comments at least once. I can't promise a long back and forth, but I'll respond to any of the comments and questions on this channel, or on this specific video, at least for one round going back and forth, to try to get you your answer. So if your question didn't get an answer, either because I didn't get to it or that, feel free to do that. With that, I just want to thank everyone so much for being a viewer, being a subscriber, joining us here on the channel. It means a lot. I love that I can make these videos. I love that there are people out there that want to watch them. And y'all are wonderful. So thanks so much for joining me for the live Q&A session. Like I said, if your question didn't get answered or you didn't like my answer to it and you want a better one, feel free to offer it in the comments below and I'll give you a better one. Oh, with that, stay skeptical, everybody.